with that, I welcome you to this week's Trauma Symposium. This week, we're talking about now what? Disaster recovery in times like this. Now, I will say that my partner, Barbara Wilson, Reverend Dr. Barbara Wilson with the Chicago Presbytery, is not able to be with us this morning. She had an emergency meeting that she had to attend. But Barbara and I came up with this idea a few weeks ago, and we did not know what in times like this was going to entail. We did not know what could possibly happen within the span of 2 weeks that now we are dealing with COVID-19, which laid bare the systemic inequities that have been a part of this country's history and legacy for a long time. But now we are also dealing with the disaster of a public health concern, as well alongside of the disaster of racialized violence and police militarization. So when we talk about disaster recovery in times like this, we now know that many of the things that have been simmering just beneath the surface of this country's reality, and to which we are oftentimes called to respond with acts of care, are now laid bare before us. And so that adds a bit of context to our conversation today. This afternoon, I am joined by two wonderful guests, and just Reverend Barbara and I both want to state again and again that if our participants and webinar viewers have enjoyed what we've been doing, we are very clear that it has been good because of the presenters who have been able to be with us and share their expertise. We are so grateful this afternoon to welcome Reverend Dr. Zachary Moon from Chicago Theological Seminary, and also Dorian Ortega, who is the founder and director of Fly Radical Therapy. I'm going to leave it to them to introduce themselves in just a bit when we get started. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. We do want to encourage our attendees to keep thinking of what's coming up for you as we are in this webinar. What we know is that none of us knew 2 weeks ago what today was going to look like, so you didn't know that when you're signing up for this webinar. Things are going to start coming up, and we invite you to start sharing some of those thoughts and some of those comments and questions, anything that comes up in the chat. You're also welcome to use the Q&A. The chat seems to be also a space that I'm noticing is where people are having some important conversation with the community. The chat creates a community of its own, which has become really kind of an important space for us to understand this not as three talking heads talking to you all, but that there becomes a live conversation that happens in the chat, which then informs how we bring and kind of respond to the chat. So for our participants who are joining us online from all points near and far, please feel free to begin conversation in the chat. We're going to be keeping an eye on those things. And also you're welcome to actually post any actual questions that are particular questions in the Q&A. We'll have each one of us has about 15 minutes to share from our particular area of expertise, and then we'll open it up for a conversation that engages our participants who have joined us, and just kind of work through what's happening as we're talking about, again, now what? Disaster recovery in times like this. And so to start us off this afternoon, I'm going to invite the Reverend Dr. Zachary A. Moon to introduce himself and go ahead and start us off for the afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Crumpton. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all. And my intention is to get us started is just to speak for about 15 minutes and kind of lay the foundation a little bit with some ideas and some language that hopefully will help us as we move forward with this content in our conversation today. I'm gonna share my screen with you all so that you can see some of the visuals as I talk. So here we are. Now what? Disaster recovery. I'll share with you just as we begin that as I have been processing everything that's been happening, as I have been caring and consulting with folks who are processing everything that's happening, one of the things that I'm very aware of is that there is this particular challenge, which often comes actually with traumatic experiences and the stress or the de-stress that we feel in the aftermath of traumatic experiences, where there is a confusion about where we are. What time is it right now? And the kind of challenge that we feel to kind of fully understand where we are makes it hard for us to feel at ease, feel comforted, be able to rely on some of our coping strategies. If I knew that this was going to be a hardship for one day, what I might do with myself. If I knew this was going to be a struggle for a week or for a month or for 6 months, we as human beings have a way of kind of adapting and accommodating if we have a sense of kind of the timeline of something like this. And the challenge for us in this is there is a great deal of uncertainty and unknown when it comes to recognizing where we are in the midst of this disaster. As Dr. Crumpton has said, we now are actually trying to navigate what feels like multiple disasters. One that we have been traversing for a period of months. In the case of what has emerged here in the last week or so, we're talking about a disaster that has been occurring for hundreds of years in this country. And the kind of intergenerational and transgenerational trauma that we carry as a nation, as communities, and as real bodies experiencing this, it raises those questions as well, increases the sense of uncertainty, increases the unknown about what a viable conclusion would even look like. So what I want to share briefly with us are some visuals to kind of understand the ways in which disasters and disaster recovery tends to kind of ebb and flow as a part of how we experience this. So here is a visual, and there's a lot here, so I'm going to take my remaining time to kind of walk us through this together. And what you'll see here is kind of like a chart, right? So there on the left, you'll see that the kind of up and down here is thinking about kind of how we're doing emotionally. I would say also how we're doing in terms of our thinking and our believing, how we're doing spiritually during this time has these kinds of ebbs and flows. And then what you're seeing, again, sort of think of it as being a chart a little bit. For those of us who haven't totally blocked out mathematics class, you know, when we were all pups in school, that axis going along the bottom is thinking about how time is elapsing as a part of what this is. So what you see here are sort of approximately kind of 6 phases or 6 markers that takes place along this timeline. So the first of those phases is what's called here pre-disaster. Now, pre-disaster may take a while. Sometimes that might be a few days or a week, anticipating that a disaster is coming along. So in the case of the COVID pandemic, you can think about, you know, maybe as far back as you know, November, December, January, and then increasingly into February, we were beginning to hear news that there was something going on seemingly far away at that time, but that the possibility that this was going to have global ramifications. So for us, that would have been the kind of pre-disaster time. And in that time, you start to see a kind of elevation of fear and uncertainty, sense of vulnerability, loss of control, lack of security. And even as we sort of think about something kind of looming toward us that we recognize may have hardship and loss as a part of it, it's very natural for us to respond with anticipatory grief, not knowing what those losses may be in particular, but anticipating that grief may come with that. And I think there is also a kind of moral distress that begins to happen for us during this phase when we see failures of infrastructure or leadership that may or may not be happening during that time. And as we recognize that, we may also be feeling some anger. We may be feeling some guilt or shame for things that maybe we've been a part of. A sort of moral assessment kind of happening during that time. So as we move, the sort of next phase is called impact, right? So impact is quick in terms of actual time, but is significant in terms of when this really begins. Now, if we're talking about a natural disaster, right, this would be like when the hurricane comes ashore, right, when that impact happens. And a lot of what we think about in terms of disaster and recovery kind of follows more that mathematics instead of a pandemic kind of disaster. But the impact here, in this case, would be, you know, when we start to see the first cases of positive tests when it comes to COVID here. Now, if we're thinking about what's been happening for the last week or so, in the murder of George Floyd, the impact there would be that event, right? So in the same way that sometimes disasters come on us quickly, have a kind of acute and intense kind of presence or insertion into our lives. Certainly that disaster has a very specific kind of impact moment. With COVID, it was a little bit more of a kind of growing impact. But what often happens for us is a sense of shock and panic. Our reactions, whatever they may, tend to be very intense. Then we often kind of shift gears into thinking about what preservation looks like, either for ourselves, for our family, our communities, our city, and sort of doing some of the assessment that takes place there. So what happens after impact is actually a really interesting kind of phenomenon, and it's called here heroic. For those of you who are care providers, particularly with some clinical background, I think it's also important to maybe think of heroic side by side with manic and what we know sort of clinically of manic. This is very high energy during this time, right? And I don't want us to sort of think too romantically about heroic, because heroic can also have some real problems to it. And that's why I think manic is also kind of helpful to kind of hold those together. High activity, high energy, but also in a way chaotic, disorganized, right? In a way, it can be destructive or deconstructive in some ways, but this is not often a time where we do very good community building, in other words, right? There's a lot of energy, but we're not necessarily doing the kind of long-term development and building during this time. So in the case of the pandemic, think about all of the kind of hero images that came out during this time, right? We were talking about first responders. We were talking about nurses. We were talking about other folks working in the hospitals. These folks were our heroes. We were talking about chaplains. Some chaplains got all up in the mainstream headlines for the first time ever, right? And we were talking about heroes in a big way. This past week, we've been talking about a heroic phase, as we've seen lots of people in pretty much every major city across our nation, and in some cases the world, talking about Black Lives Matter, talking about we've got to stand up, we've got to be seen, we've got to be heard, and think about the kind of energy that's bringing us together in those protest moments is also that kind of heroic, but also kind of manic energy, right? We're feeling some intense moral distress. We're feeling that anger. We're feeling that disgust, that accountability isn't happening, that these patterns and these structures continue to perpetuate violence against Black and brown bodies, right? And this is what's really energizing this particular moment as well. So whether we're talking about the pandemic or whether we're talking about how we're engaging and witnessing structural systemic violence and how do we resist that, in both cases you would see a kind of parallel when it comes to heroic or manic phase. Now, the next phase is called honeymoon, and that is actually kind of meant to have a kind of romantic kind of allusion to it, in that this is often a kind of culmination of what happens with all of that kind of hot, intense, heroic, manic energy. Now, sometimes honeymoon looks like, hey, something good happened, okay? We got some results, right? Some folks in leadership positions actually started doing what they ought to be doing, basically in response to the kind of heroic actions that were taking place. But whether we ever actually experience a kind of good sense of accomplishment, sense of goal attainment, even if a good thing happens, if a honeymoon happens, the honeymoon doesn't last very long, right? The honeymoon is brief, it's fleeting, and it's transitional. And while it might feel good in the moment, what you'll see kind of coming on that kind of downshift is that may be our kind of emotional and psycho-spiritual high, but there is also a very dramatic ebb that happens in the aftermath of that. And I think this is actually the one that is maybe most important for us to talk about as care providers, as religious leaders, to understand for ourselves first and foremost, but also to understand for the communities and folks that we're caring for. So this phase, phase 5, is called disillusionment. what you're seeing here often, even whether a good thing has happened kind of at the peak or culmination or not, there tends to be a letdown, right? A sort of, we've been on this kind of adrenaline junket, basically. And then when that adrenaline starts moving out of our system, we feel empty. We feel lonely comes up in a big kind of way for us during that time. We can feel discouraged. We can even feel a sense of betrayal at how things happened or didn't happen. So all that good kind of galvanizing, kind of cohesive energy that we felt during that kind of uptick in the energy through that kind of heroic phase up to the peak with the honeymoon, that we're feeling right now when I think about the protests, right? People are coming together. People are feeling like, I'm angry, but I'm not the only person angry. That's a deep, important kind of sense of belonging that's taking place in that moment. But without the kind of infrastructure that we need to sustain our movements, also to sustain our public health apparatus in the face of the pandemic, as we sort of talk about these in parallel tracks, without that necessary infrastructure, there's going to be this kind of drop off. There's going to be this decline. We're not going to be able to sustain this kind of intense peak energy in an ongoing kind of way. And one of the things that I certainly want to note now, and I hope maybe in our conversation we'll speak to a little bit more, but as this energy is starting to ebb, the other thing that we see really across our society is this is where privilege starts to re-exert itself. Okay, this is when the folks who have the privilege to do so get back to business as usual. And I'm thinking here about economic privilege, right? The folks who've got jobs to get back to, they get back to, right? The folks who have racial privilege, right? The folks for whom this isn't a reality of being racially profiled on a day-to-day basis, they can kind of get back to business as usual. For the folks who don't have those privileges, there isn't a return to business as usual, but in fact, a sense that actually that the trauma and the loss and the anguish of what's happening as that energy kind of deflates out of us personally and out of us collectively, that we feel those structural injustices, because we start to see the way in which privilege is re-exerting itself to organize the sense of kind of business as usual. Now, as that's happening, there may be re-triggering events that may take us kind of back into some higher energy, or in fact, we may drop altogether. And lastly, just to take us there quickly, is phase 6, which looks like reconstruction. And I think it's important to just say as simply and candidly as possible, reconstruction doesn't always happen. Okay, we don't always learn the lessons that we ought to learn from disasters, whether those are natural disasters, whether those are public health disasters, whether those are the ongoing disasters of what's happened with racism in the United States of America, right? And I think, I mean, we could do a full 90 minutes talking about the way in which Reconstruction, including Reconstruction as we used it in American history, was a very temporary kind of experiment politically and economically, socially in this country. And then it was very much thrust back into the disaster space that African American folks knew in this country. So I don't want to say that just because you see these phases here to suggest to you that these always happen like this. And I think the constructive phase, the kind of new building phase, that's something that we as religious leaders, as care providers, as community leaders, we've got to take this seriously. We've got to have vision on this, and we've got to say, when we have the energy, we have got to invest in this part. Otherwise, we're not doing the necessary preparatory work to mitigate future threats, to do the kind of necessary institutional reforms that will change the way that the next disaster is experienced. As far as what you'll see here, the important things that can happen during this phase is responsibility taking from leadership and for collective bodies. You have an opportunity to actually more adequately grieve the losses that have happened. And here again, religious leaders, chaplains, other care providers are necessary at helping to really authorize and empower spaces where people can do, complicated grieving, grieving that may have had to be deferred in some cases for years. But how do we make sure that we create the ritual and sacred spaces that we need to grieve adequately and richly in this time. We certainly have an opportunity to build up our infrastructure, build our community, strengthen um, our communities. But again, I do just want to leave us with the sobering understanding that if your community is constantly being bombarded with violence or disaster of any kind, this phase of Reconstruction is disrupted and interrupted with so much constancy that you in fact don't see folks getting to have adequate time to grieve. You don't see communities who have a time to organize themselves politically in sustainable ways to be able to resist what needs to be resisted. And this is a time where we need to learn lessons. And if we don't take this phase seriously, we run the serious risk of, in fact, not doing the necessary transformation to our political, our economic, and our social systems to be able to have the better future that I think many of us can certainly imagine and we hope for at this time. So I'll stop for now, and I look forward to our discussion.
Wonderful. There's so much good information in there. I do want to ask just very quickly, am I hearing, so I see the graphic, I understand the phases, a good overview of the phases. Dr. Moon, would you say, like, could you identify a space on the graphic where we might necessarily identify ourselves now, today, collectively, right? Because I understand that this is an individual and collective kind of back and forth, right? Because one person or one community might be there, another person or community might be somewhere else. Could you kind of just kind of maybe point out some points that may kind of help us locate ourselves a little bit today?
Yes, and I was going to see if I could pull back up the presentation just so we could see that one more time together.
Sure. Is it giving you the business?
It is a little bit. Let's see here. There we go. Okay, so I'm hoping that you all can see the graphic again here. Again, I think there is some. It's worthy of conversation. I think as we think about providing care for folks, I think it's good for us to keep this in mind, because there may be some folks who actually kind of locate themselves, as Dr. Crumpton has suggested, different places, right? This isn't just we're all in this together, we're all having the exact same general experience. There's a lot of particularity to this. And if we are folks who are trauma survivors already, we're going to navigate this very, very differently, depending on what those traumas are. And what I would want to just say again very clearly is we need to do some kind of self-reflection here to think about, hey, how am I doing in the midst of all of this? How's my family doing? Even beyond when I think about the kind of community work, the kind of care work that I want to be about during this time, recognizing that there are real differences there. I think I would say I think we're when it comes to the COVID pandemic, I think we are on that downslope, in that some of the kind of vigilance that folks have had around sheltering in place and around kind of taking care of themselves is beginning to kind of ebb now. You see things beginning to reopen. You hear in some cases about whole cities kind of, or states going that direction. And so there's a little bit of a letdown there. Now that letdown may be with a sense of excitement or anticipation, right? So I don't just mean to say it's all doom and gloom on the downturn of that, but as we become less vigilant in a public health conscious kind of way, we also certainly run the risk of maybe a second wave of infection, of not sort of being responsible in the ways that we ought to be responsible during this time. So in that way, it's very much a kind of tenuous time. And even as that's happening for many people, I mean, there are still folks who are going every day to the front lines of the pandemic, our hospital workers, our first responders. You know, those folks haven't experienced any honeymoon yet. They are still in the fight today. They know they're going to be in the fight tomorrow. You know, things might be opening up over there, but things are still very intense and very acute for what's happening.
Essential workers who weren't able, so non-hospital essential workers who never were able to shelter in place in the first place, right?
I think that's very accurate. So I think we have to recognize that even as this sort of has this kind of two-dimensionality to it, that really this needs to be a much more more complicated in our imagination, that we recognize different dimensions and intersections that are taking place here. That as you say, Dr. Crumpton, kind of what your job was, what privileges you had to either be sheltering in place or not being allowed to shelter in place. The way in which economic realities shaped that, in terms of I don't have the privilege to stay at home because I have to keep working because my job says you need to keep working or you're going to lose your job, right? There's that kind of positioning that's gonna take place there. And if we're providing care, we need to be cognizant, hey, I might be feeling one kind of way, I might be thinking one kind of way about this disaster. The person that I'm providing care for, they may be experiencing the phases of this disaster very differently. So let's be attentive to that. Let's listen for that, and let's recognize where different care needs are going to be at different phases of this. I think
Nice.
that would certainly be worthy of our attention.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful, as we're all trying to get a beat on just where you started, where are we in all of this. Dr. Moon, I think what was really helpful in your conversation, lots of things, but for us to also be thinking about the individual needs as well as the collective needs. So you helped us kind of identify where we may be as a society, as a global society, kind of dealing with the pandemic, and also the pandemic within the pandemic, right? Around race and violence. So there's a collective awareness, collective caretaking. I think it's also important, incredibly necessary for us, as you point out, for us to check in with ourselves individually. How am I doing? How are my people, not my people large scale, but like flesh and blood, chosen family, kin, right? My mama, my daddy, my kids, my sister, my brother, my partner, my lover, my, people that I have immediate connection with. And also our immediate connections with ourselves. And for that, we're going to go ahead and make the switch over to Ms. Dorian Ortega, who is a therapist extraordinaire, has an amazing radical way of approaching therapy, which I think radical times require radical approaches, which is why I'm so excited about what she has to offer to us. Dorian, go ahead and take us in.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Moon, for that wonderful presentation. It was really insightful. The takeout for me that I kind of just boxed out, I just really loved what you said about communal complicated grieving. That really stuck out for me. And so thank you for explaining the phases and how complex we can also like move forward and be backwards and in different phases. And I'm glad to be here to talk about the approach to therapy that I practice. And so my practice, which I just opened this year, is called Fly Radical Therapy, and Fly stands for First Love Yourself. And the intention of Fly Radical Therapy is to provide intentional services to Black, Indigenous, people of color. And where you see the title, it says a healing Hodona approach to self-love. Ideally, the way I think about therapy and the way that therapy has been approached for people in general, and historically in Western society, has really been this individualistic approach. And the approach is more about the person, right? The individual, and also how they are able to sustain themselves individually. And so the approach doesn't necessarily match cultural values for people of color. People of color are very much a collective and very much communal. And so thinking about how this applies to people of color retrospectively is really important to have a focus on individual self-care, which really is self-preservation, how to maintain your mental health, your physical health, and your spiritual health systemically. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how systemic approaches to therapy is so important, and that essentially is what radical therapy is. Lots of folks may not be familiar with radical therapy. Most folks might be more familiar with other forms of psychotherapy approaches, such as psychoanalysis or cognitive behavioral therapy. Radical therapy is actually a therapeutic approach that was established in the 60s and 70s during very high intense racial discord. And so this approach is the approach that I use to address systemic issues in society and how they affect the individual, and what it is that the individual can control in order to continue to develop their liberation. And the development and stages of liberation tend to end with with a connection or collaboration with other community, and with action steps that provide this kind of approach to systemic issues and ways to address them. So it is a complex approach, however, very simply kind of focusing on the self. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. So the approach really is developed. I explained radical therapy, and the approach is a very much womanist approach. And womanist approach is essentially thinking about equality. Thinking about equality not only for gender, but also for racial equality, for status equality and economic status, as well as immigration status. These womanist approach, if folks want to look into that, is very much specific to equality. And I have a question on here, and I would love for folks to even feel comfortable to answer this on your own, of how does oppression make you feel? How does it make you feel? And how can you identify a specific feeling attached to oppression? And when you identify that feeling, can you identify where you feel it in your body? Can you also identify what your spirit feels like? And can you also identify where you might be feeling pushed or pulled? And this is where systemic issues are important to understand. And I'm going to go to the slide 4, which is on the systems. And so if folks understand the Grafenbrenner model and the ecological system, this is the approach that I use for folks to really get a sense of like where they might be feeling pushed and where they might be feeling pulled. And so the individual, as you can see, lies in the middle, and we all really are centers of our own universe, right? And our own world. And then we're surrounded by our systems, who are our families, our peers, our schools, our churches, healthcare services. And then we have these mesosystems, right, that are the structures in place that we need for these systems to work, right? This is employment. These are the structures in place. And then outside of that system, we have the exo and macro systems, which really are the services. These are the industries. These are the politics. These are the morals. These are the values. This is the cultures. This is the traditions. And we can flux and flow and feel pushed and pulled towards any particular system, depending on the context and what we're dealing with. And so I really appreciated the discussion on disaster, because at this point in time, depending on the phase that we're going through or the accessibility to resources, we may be pushed or pulled in certain systems at this point in time. More specifically, like what was mentioned, our families, right? Our threats to survival right now, especially for people of color, especially for Black men, Black women, Black families, is really a high risk right now. And we have to recognize that that is real. And survival skills and survival and traumatic, especially chronic traumatic triggers, are going to threaten our survival responses. And folks may be feeling like they have to run, they have to fight, or some folks are freezing right now because of, again, the chronic traumas that continue to affect the systems based off the historical oppression. Some folks are checking out, and that is their survival. And this is how some folks respond. So I'm going to go to slide 5 here and just talk about how important it is to really think about, again, the cultural collective and your cultural values and your roots and your history, and thinking about the difference between white feminism and bell hooks. And so I have on here white feminism, which is a very much what we see in historically, when it's come to radical movements, they have historically been started by like the white population that are maybe feeling like they need to stand up for people of color or for marginalized folks. And so when we saw white feminism come out of history, we saw the feminism really was for white women. It was for that particular group to have access to employment and economic ability, stability. It wasn't meant for women of color. And so when womanism is mentioned, womanism comes from a Black author who talks about how important it is to have equality across the spectrum. And so when I mentioned bell hooks, I mentioned how important it is to be all about love. And so I'm gonna put her little, I don't know if you could see my camera, but all about love is literally a Bible for me. I really appreciate the talks about love. And I actually pinned out a quote that I wanted to read for you all, just given the times that we're living in, and as I skip over to some tools that we can use. When we're thinking about describers and we're thinking about our words, it's really important to utilize specific words that are identifying your situation. Good and bad are not really good identifiers, and that I just use good identifiers. They're not really quality identifiers. They're not getting at the core of what we're feeling. And so it is important to extend a little bit our vocabularies when we're understanding what we're trying to understand what we're feeling. And so I want to put that out there when we're trying to process information and we're trying to like really understand and be in tune with ourselves. We need to use our words and we need to use our vocabulary, because it's going to help us to describe the complexity of what's going on right now. I'm going to give you this quote from Bell Hooks, All About Love. And this is from her chapter on clarity. And it goes like this: definitions are vital starting points for the imagination. What we cannot imagine cannot come into being. A good definition marks our starting point and lets us know where we want to end up. As we move toward our desired destination, we chart the journey, creating a map. We need a map to guide us to our journey of love, starting with a place where we know what we mean when we speak of love. And I want to follow up with how colonialism makes you feel, capitalism, if you want to go further. Again, I want to remind you, as I ask that question, start to think about definitions of what you feel. And if you can't think about a word, think about a color, think about a shape, think about what is happening in your body when I even say that word. So I'm going to move to trauma and the prevalence of trauma. And I'm not going to read this whole slide, to be honest. I think folks can find the statistics, and this is probably outdated, but it's probably very much underestimated. But trauma is very relevant for folks of color in particular. And the history of trauma has been very much overlooked and undermined and underestimated. When we're thinking about radicalizing therapy, it is important to understand the prevalence of trauma with our communities and how chronic it has been, and the accumulative stress that has happened for years and years and years. What we're not talking about in mental health is the psychosis and the pathology of racism. I'm not going to go into that right now, but I do want folks to consider how common PTSD is not being diagnosed. It's not being diagnosed as much as it should be. However, not only thinking about how we're helping individuals through this crisis, through the chronic traumas, but also who are we holding accountable for the consistent
Dorian, are you there?
Triggering of traumas. And this is when we think about the dominant. This is when we, I'm sorry, this is when we get to think about the oppressor or powers at play and how we hold systems accountable for re-traumatizing and re-triggering folks. There isn't much discussion here about pathologizing racism. And so when we're thinking about trauma-informed care, this is important to consider. And the reason why is because when we're providing trauma-informed care, sometimes folks re-victimize individuals and rely on them to figure out their own way of coping when there are bigger systems at play that are going to continue to keep folks sick. And so I want folks to consider trauma-informed care as an approach to figure out what folks need, but also to really understand and go beyond what their environment and context is telling them. Because our responsibility and role as counselors and practitioners is to not only work with the individual and their individual needs, but we need to understand and we should be assessing their context, their ecosystem, and what is at play, because folks sometimes respond with needs that are survival based, and it might go beyond what they're really seeing right now. And we have responsibilities to be able to try to at least consider these in our treatment with folks, in our help with folks. So I'm going to go to the next slide, which is symptoms of survival responses. These are really similar to what Dr. Moon was describing in what's phase, I think in some of the phases, how we respond and how we react. These are going to look very different depending on the phase that you're in of the disaster or what phase you're in your own context, but these are common symptoms. So I again won't read all of them, but you can understand that the first bullet point is related to depression. These are all the symptoms of clinical depression. The second bullet point is related to clinical anxiety. And then the last point are symptoms related to post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm going to go to practical ways to manage the impact of racial trauma. Before I do that, though, I did want to discuss that post-traumatic stress is looking differently for folks of color. And if folks want to do research, if they are inclined to research Dr. Joy, I can't remember her first name, but Dr. Joy is a sociologist who coined the term post-traumatic slave syndrome. And this is a very, I'm sorry?
Joy DeGruy.
Joy DeGruy, thank you. She coined the term post-traumatic slave syndrome. And these are, again, important terminologies for folks to really, who are in the caregiving world, to be very mindful of these particular terms, because your approach could look different when you're working with folks. I'm going to go through this. This will be like the last two more slides that I have. Practical ways to manage the impact of racial trauma. And this is from Dr. Ebony. She's online. You can check her out on some of her information, but I'll go through this list at least specifically because I think it's important, again, when we're thinking about loving ourselves and caring for ourselves. At this point, for people of color, it is about survival. It is about existence, and your existence is key and critical. And so if we are just sitting back to feel feelings, it isn't okay to feel feelings. I think historically, people of color, especially the Black community, have not had privilege to feel feelings. And I think that this is very important to understand that feelings in the mental health field have been, I don't even know if the word is privilegized, but it's been a privilege to feel sad, to feel angry. This is not a privilege many people of color get, more particularly Black folks, more specifically Black women and Black men. Usually when it comes to responses, there is this understanding of what was mentioned, like this hysteria, and this has been a stereotype for people of color since mental health, since the DSM-2, when there was actual diagnosis for specific about mental health more openly in our communities, and I say folks of color communities, we are now having permission to feel. And so number one is literally do not apologize for feeling what you feel. Whenever you catch yourself saying, I'm sorry, try to find a way to take it back, because this is important to relearn and destigmatize our own values of what we feel. And if you're a person of color, standing firm in your feelings and not apologizing for it is an act of revolution within itself. Number two is honoring your emotions, right? That's how you honor them. You stand firm, and many of us learn how to avoid feelings by being busy, maybe working too much, or maybe responding too much, and not holding space for your emotions, not giving yourself a couple of minutes or some time of discernment. And this could be really helpful for seminarians. It's like, I think folks who are healers have this sense of responsibility that they always have to have it okay and like together. And I think when you're able to understand that you're also emotionally impacted and triggered, we're able to allow others to do the same with us, and we're able to build deeper bonds of empathy. Number three, breathing is critical. Breathing, taking deep breaths, and finding your flow of breath is helpful. And also help us work through lookup that intentionally invoke us to feel our strong or uncomfortable emotions. And so breathing exercises are critical in times like this, especially because our breathing can impact our physiological responses. We might have blood pressure problems. And so if your breathing is off and your blood pressure is high, it's not going to help. And so deep breaths and relaxation breathing actually lower blood pressure and help increase blood flow. These are able to maintain our as well as our mental makeup.
Excuse me, Dorian, can you do me a favor? It seems like we're breaking up, and one of the things that we notice is that sometimes if we either do the visual or the audio, then we get to choose. So would you mind just turning your camera off for a minute while you continue, and we'll bring you back after you finish, and just because I don't want people to miss what you're saying is so important.
Sure. Can you hear me fine now?
Yes, we can hear you, and we're going to hope that helps. Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. It could be my service, but I wanted to move to just remind that deep breathing. Number three, taking slow, deep breaths can be really helpful to manage our traumatic responses. And breath work, I just wanted to remind that breath work can work in different ways, and that we could take deep breaths for relaxation. We could also work on certain types of breaths to invoke and help process the stronger emotions that we feel. So breath work is something recommended as well. And number four, limited exposure and engagement as needed. And this is really like talking about how we're triggering ourselves in terms of social media, the news. I've been encouraging folks to have a self-controlled harm reduction approach to media and exposure and engagement. Harm reduction is about reducing harm, right? And so if you are going to engage with folks, make sure you're being intentional about your engagement. Checking your ego and your ego would be really important here. So your values and your grandiosities are going to be important here. And the last one, again, choose safe ways to be involved. If there are a slew of ways for folks to work on social liberation, and it can happen one with yourself. You need to survive, and folks need you. And so your information that you hold is valuable. And so self-preservation is very important. Connecting with others and having a social support system is also very important. This is where I go to Hodona healing, and I'll explain that Hodona healing is Hodona, and the word Hodona comes from, it's a more Puerto Rican term that is a term of endearment, and it basically means the agitator. So this is the person that nobody likes because they're always complaining about something. And so Hodona healing is basically an agitator healing. And so it's about creating safe spaces for restorative justice. And these are monthly circles that I've created. I help create with some activists in the community. And we meet once a month, and we do healing circles. And some folks might be familiar with peace circles. This is very similar. We set agreements and boundaries. We build awareness about systemic oppression, and we have collective community-based healing approaches as well as alternative-based. So we'll have moments where we are using evidence-based approaches, again, like cognitive behavioral therapy or thought challenging, as well as including Reiki or breath work or meditation or oils, using essential oils or using natural or herbal remedies. We come from a sense of reawakening the roots. And so this is thinking about the importance of ancestral wellness and ancestral healing. How do we tap into who we are and where we've come from, and root and awaken those roots to give us that strength that we may need to continue to do the work that we're doing. Taking up and creating safe spaces. When you're a person of color and you're a healer, there is this condition that folks may have been aware of called imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome definitely helps to deter the people of color's goals and missions. And so sometimes there is a moment where you'll need to take up space and quiet other people up and demand your space and your voice, because people of color's voices have been intentionally silenced. And so taking up space and creating safe spaces when you can. So if you can't take up space and it's too unsafe for you, I suggest creating it yourself. And that's what we did here with the Poetry Justice Healing Circles, is we just did it for ourselves because there wasn't accessibility for folks who are activists who already have a hard time with trust in the bigger systems. And so this was an intentional healing circle for activists, and it continues to be. Compassionate care, is really important. Compassionate care is not just about yourself, it's about community. And the struggle is going to continue to be there because of how embedded a lot of these systems are. And if we can take care of each other, it can be a beautiful struggle. I'll just end again with bell hooks because I just love her. But I'll just end with this quote, and we can end. Community cannot take root in a divided life. Long before community assumes eternal shape and form, it must be present as a seed in the undivided self. Only as we are in communion with ourselves can we find community with others. So that, I know the whole thing didn't show up, but I just read it out and I can send it to anyone. So that's all. I hope I didn't take too much of your time, but thank you for listening, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Dorian. You can go ahead and turn your camera back on so we can see you. Your presentation was so rich. I wrote down a few notes, well, several notes actually. I think what I was really interested in is harm reduction, right? That care is about or related to harm reduction, not just reaction, but reducing the amount of harm and the caring experience, right? So there's there's harm that's already been done that's bringing a person in for care, but then to also reduce the amount of harm that can happen in the moment of care was incredibly important. And also the importance that the macro system, the graphic that you showed, that kind of helped us think about that we exist at an intersection, right? And so what we're feeling can often be the result of those intersections kind of converging in us, in ourselves, and that care has to be mindful of these intersections. Really wonderful. I'm excited about what the conversation is going to look like. Again, we encourage our participants to get active in the chat. I see some activity there. I'm really excited. Keep it going. I'm actually going to take one of the last things that you mentioned as the start point for my contribution to this conversation. I love what you wrote in the Jordana approach, the importance of reawakening the roots, reawakening our ancestral roots. So I actually am going to start my contribution with a presentation. It's kind of a little bit of a video, shall we say, that I actually developed a few months ago and decided this actually is a pretty good thing to start us off with for this conversation. So for folks who are looking, who are watching online, this may be a really good time for you to turn your sound up. People who are also listening audio wise, this is also a great time. You want to see it if you can, but I understand that some people have dialed in. At another time, you'll be able to download it or see it when we post it online. But let's go ahead and get started with this, one of my favorite musicians of all time, which I learned from my mother also, who was one of my favorite people on the planet. And I'm hoping that this will get us into a conversation about what it means to reawaken our roots as the things that keeps us alive, that keeps us grounded, and that also keeps us, that nurtures our spirits, right? Because you all, Zach and Dorian, you all have named the importance of understanding psychologically and collectively and socially what's going on. The third dimension, which runs through everything that you all have talked about, is the notion, the current of spirit. So I'm gonna start with this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. It isn't terribly too long, but it's got really good music. So I hope that'll at least hold people's attention. So I'm hoping that that was a visual presentation of what it means to begin to think about reawakening the roots. I'm thinking very much, Dorian and Zach, about what you said about we have to care for ourselves. And it's important for us to recognize that we come from somewhere, right? Those images that we saw kind of chronicled my life, but more importantly, I hope you notice the people who were involved in my life, right? I come, let's see, how can I say this? My parents were born on the west side of Chicago to parents who were from Arkansas, Tennessee, and Mississippi. And I grew up in the 4200, 4123 West on West End. And I remember as a little girl that I was safe on my neighborhood, on my block, because each person, each house, the members of those households knew my family. Now, this is when I was a little girl before we moved out of that neighborhood. But I knew that I was safe. And what I remember the most were the conversations that would happen as they were giving me ice cream or sharing. Now, I don't eat pork now, but best believe that back in the day, I used to eat me some pork rinds. That's right. Some skins, shall we say. You know, I would go to the neighborhood, the neighbors, and they would give me ice cream and skins and pickles, and also watch out for me, telling me not to play in the street. And also I was allowed every once in a while to sit down and listen to grown folks' conversation. And those grown folks' conversations were not about pickles and ice cream and skins. They were about the politics that were happening less than 3 miles away from them, down by decisions or related to decisions that were made about them, but which they had felt they had very little say on the level of politics. And so I grew up in a neighborhood where you saw a couple of my graduations. I grew up in a neighborhood where people would, see you getting in the car and going to graduation. They would come and wave out, come and wave and say congratulations. So you understood that this thing that you're doing now is not yours, it's ours, right? And I bring that up for us to think about at this moment as we are facing amazing moments of heroism, disillusionment, all the phases that you named, Dr. Moon, as we're trying to do radical healing and the challenges that bring us to the need radical healing. There are moments where I believe that spiritually, on one level, we are bereaved, right? There's a part of us that is bereft. And so I know we talk about lament, but I think we need to be a little more specific about how lament is about despair. Lament is about, it is bad, it is not getting better, it has not shown itself to be better yet, and I don't know if there will be a yet, right? Yet at the same time, there oftentimes is this sense of being compelled to go find out about the yet. Right? So I actually don't get angry with people who say that they're mad at God or they're giving up on the church, because they're still in the conversation, right? They still have some skin in the game. Elsewise, they just walk away and leave it, right? And so I think that it's really important for us as we're thinking about what is my role in this work? How do I keep pushing when I'm especially for our chaplains, when I'm tired of being at the bedside of people who don't have what they need. I'm tired from having to be at the bedside of people I don't know, but I'm the only human being that they will know as they take their last breaths, right? I'm tired for the pastors who are like, I'm tired of burying people. I'm tired of not being able to call people together in the same ways that we normally could so that we could touch and we could hug. I am simply tired. Right? But at the same time, there's something churning on the inside that compels us to keep moving. And what I really want us to think about is that, and the reason why I showed the people that I come from, is for us to remember the oldest picture, or the oldest person shown in those pictures is my great-grandmother. Her name was Essie B. Essie B was the mother of Helen. Helen is the mother of Janice. Janice is my mother. And so what I recognize is that Essie B, I found an older picture of her where she looked tired and worn out, and she was probably doing some sort of manual domestic labor that I don't even want to hear about or know about, because the fury of what she had to endure so that I could be, right? And so I think it's important for us that as we are navigating this sense of needing to do something different, wanting to do something different, alongside of a general disgust, right, around the social systems that make it hard, right, and around the sense of despair, the amount of loss, for us to understand that we do not care only for our own sake. And we don't even only care for this generation. First of all, the care that we are demonstrating to lean on the strength and understand that as care providers, we are stepping into a legacy, right? Whether they're in your bloodstream or not, right? We are, as persons who take up the mantle of care, we are stepping into a multi-generational legacy of care that has had to grapple with inequity and disparity, right? So we're stepping into the line and lineage of our ancestors in our profession, as well as also in our families. And so that helps us understand that our now, even though we are frustrated, angry, disgusted, people don't have what they need, our now is the fruit of their commitment to care then, right? And so to also understand that we can't just give up, right? Like we want to, and that's not the same thing as taking a nap or taking a rest or taking a sabbatical or tapping out, right? And saying somebody else is gonna have to pick it up today because I have to care for myself. It's not the same thing, but it is the commitment to saying, I'm here for the next. I don't know what the next is going to be, but to understand also, and one of the things that was important in those pictures that I showed, the importance of taking a sabbatical, whether it's a day, an hour, a week, taking a sabbatical away from everything to connect with those who mean something to you, so that you can be reminded, right, that they prayed and worked for you and fought, because it wasn't just, old folks say, watch and pray, right? Because sometimes you got to get up off your knees and swing on somebody to make room, right, for what has to get done. But the folks who watched and prayed for us to get to this point of despair, which is real weird, right? To the notion, I think this kind of gets at what you were talking about, Dr. Moon, about when we go through disasters, we want to get to the reconstruction phase so we develop something new so it'll be better. But the reality is, as we saw with the inequities that have been exposed with COVID-19, and also the violence that we're seeing right now against persons of color, unarmed oftentimes, right? Waged against them by the police who have undertones of race running through how they function, right? That there was not the reconstruction. And so there are moments where we have to recognize that we step into a legacy of care and care providers who worked, fought, struggled, prayed, laughed, danced, cried, so we could get to this point, even in this point of despair, so that we would have within our bones, right, within a faith that can handle the contradictions and the tensions. And I'm not talking about a cheap grace or easy faith. I'm talking about the kind of faith that you fight to stay connected. And sometimes you have to fight God to stay connected with God, right? That's the ugly edge of lament that I think is important. But to recognize you have been brought here for a time, right? And when I say brought here, I don't mean that God breathes the breath of life in us, but I mean the work of our ancestors, the work of those that we know and don't know, the work of those who we call counting the great cloud of witnesses. They have brought us here to this space, right? And they join us here in this space. And I think that it's important for us to think, as we're struggling through disaster preparedness, the frustration that disaster after disaster continues to happen, and how do you prepare for things that keep on happening when you never got through the first one, right? That there is something kind of like a fire in our faith that is able to handle that contradiction, right? And that doesn't shy away from when something ain't right, right? And to know that God doesn't, for me, to know that God does not shy away from our accusation and our frustration, right? When something ain't right, and that we have the importance, I almost wanted to say the importance of remaining open, but I want to say the importance of remaining in it with God, even if the in it is a fight, even if the in it is a protestation, even if the in it is only a lament. Not because sometimes we want to say, oh, you must praise God. This ain't that kind of party. It's good enough that I'm in the relationship with God. We'll worry about the praise later. But there's something to be said about how times like this require an in it kind of faith, which is the faith of our ancestors. And if we can continue to stay in it, it will be the gift that we hand off to the next generation who are coming in the line of succession to join the ongoing healing work, right? Of staying ready, of regrouping when you never had a chance to regroup from the last time or the times before that. And the importance of recognizing that we look back, not just to learn the strategies, but to also remember. We look back to remember that we have been loved, that we have been cared about, right? So much of what we do involves a fight and a push. Dorian, I heard you talking about noticing where we are being pulled or where we are being pushed. And I think that it's important to recognize that, yes, we get pulled, yes, we get pushed, and there's a third element that is just as powerful, and that is the gift of love. How we have been loved in the past, how love is stretching out right now towards us when we are too tired and we just need to let go, that there is love so long as we are committed to looking for it, right? And so to recognize that our faith has a past, that past is ongoing. B, that we have to remember to stop and be in relationship with those who love us, because that's not just social time, that's not just psychological time, that is spiritual nurture and care. See the importance of being in it with God, even if that means swinging it out, right? And so I'm not saying fold up on your frustration and keep it to yourself. I mean, get in it. And let me just say, I can speak on firsthand experience about that, right? And then finally, that we're in it for love. We show up, we press, we push, we pull, we refuse to be quiet, we take up space, we take to the streets. And though there may be a righteous indignation to how we do what we do, it's all about love, Dorian, as you mentioned, right? We do this because we deserve what we need to be able to thrive and to be free and to love one another and to receive that love. And so I think that the pieces I would hope for us to continue to ponder that as we feel a sense and an urge to do something in response to what we're seeing, to remember that the urge is not new. It might be new in your awareness, but the urge, the sense to move, is transgenerational, it's ancestral, it's an invitation to join, to become aware of your role in the legacy of keeping life alive, right? Of respecting life. And in that regard, we're not alone. And in that regard, we can have, I think, a bit more of what we need, because then you also find the voices of those who are also grappling, the ancestral voices of those who have grappled with what is our role in this time. You find the contemporary right now next door neighbor or webinar about how we grapple with this work. And so those are a few of the pieces that I'm hoping we can kind of spend some time on as we continue to think about disaster preparedness, that to be prepared is also to look back to where we've been, know that we're not alone, and that it's an ongoing process, a commitment of being with one another. And so we've got about 15 minutes remaining on the call. I see we've got some activity in the chat. What I'm going to do first, because I'm moderating the chat by myself, my first thing, excuse me, that I want to kind of a question to bounce us out, and then I'm going to check over the chat and come back with some other questions. Dorian, I'm going to ask you, why do you think it's important to reclaim this particular type of radicalized healing that you're talking about? And what are the ways that folk can support this kind of work?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Thank you for your presentation. I think it's just so fitting. The reason fly radical therapy came out as an approach and a therapeutic approach is because, again, the systems that I have been trained in do not adequately prepare counselors, mental health professionals to have intentional harm reduction approaches and accountability approaches to therapy. Traditionally, therapy again has been focused on the individual, and after I graduated, I had a commitment to only focus my services on folks of color, but with the intent that it's about self-preservation. It's about you continuing to survive. How do you love yourself? How do you first love yourself in order for you to continue to move forward? And if folks are interested in helping to support where I provide services, so I am a part of a network in Humboldt Park called the Honeycomb Network. And we provide not only is it a safe and brave space for Black, Indigenous, people of color, it's also a co-networking space for folks who are creatives and artists. And the approach that I have is intersectional. And so I provide my therapy approach, and then there's also other alternative healing approaches, such as herbal care. And so there is someone who studies herbal care who provides herbal remedies for natural or physical ailments. There's also meditation that there is going to be provided there. There's also spiritual guidance. And so that's, if folks are interested in supporting, we have memberships available for individuals who are interested in a membership to provide space and join a collective. And it's at thehoneycombnetwork.com.
Thank you so much, Dorian. Dr. Moon, I have a question for you. I'm thinking about, when we think about the radicalized healing that Dorian just described in her work, I'm kind of running that up alongside of the cycles of disaster recovery and also some of your work around moral injury and decision making. Can you say a little bit about how being in particular phases impacts how we make decisions in our everyday life? Because I think that maybe we might be seeing people that we know well, and even ourselves, right, that we know ourselves pretty well, but we find ourselves responding to things differently than into ways that may be out of character. So I'm kind of wondering, Dr. Moon, if that is related or reflection, if there's some kind of connection between the disasters of recovery and how it may be changing how we show up in the world just in general.
Yes, I mean, I think when we think about particularly the kind of intensification of energy that's happening during that heroic phase and the kind of deflating of that energy in the disillusionment phase, those are both phases of acute crisis, right? Mm-hmm. One that's got a whole lot of energy to it, and one that is kind of losing energy. We might know those if we're folks who provide care as being one and both of the sides of the coin of anger and depression, right? That those two are dance partners often in folks' lives. That when anger exhausts itself, when anger is not attended to, is not allowed to signal to us about the broken or the harm or the wrong that we're witnessing, the danger, the threat that might be looming, when anger isn't allowed to have a kind of life-giving power in our lives, when it meets a barrier, when it is shamed out of our expression, when folks are told you can't bring that kind of energy, or you can't bring the kind of language that comes with that, you can't bring that around here. That leads to a kind of isolation, a kind of alienation, a kind of loneliness that often kind of ebbs back into some sense of feeling deflated or depressed in that space. So when we start thinking about care and where does care come alongside, I think that's I think that's crucial when we're thinking of particularly attentive to care of communities of color. I really appreciated Dorian's wisdom on this, to not think in sort of blanket essentialized kinds of ways about, oh, folks need this, right? We're already getting ourselves into trouble as care providers, because then usually our default position is, this is what I would need in this situation, so let me just go ahead and provide this to somebody else. And particularly when we're working in multiracial spaces, in multi-gendered spaces, that can become very fraught, and even unintentionally, I'll bet, nonetheless harmful in spaces like that as well. So hear her guidance and the power of that guidance that Doreen has shared with us. We need to think that people are impacted by these disasters differently, because in fact the circumstances that folks are subjected to within this national and global context is different for people of color than it is for white folks. It's different for women. It's different for transgender folk than it is for cisgender male folk, and on and on and on, right? We could continue to layer the intersectional complexities of this. And it's necessary to do that if we're gonna provide good care. One of the things that I think makes care challenging as we think about disaster is when folks are all energized with that heroic energy, one of the things is nobody wants to slow down, right? Nobody wants to go take Dorian up on her beautiful invitation to come along and talk to her and talk to some other good folks. No, I got to be out there in the street. That's the only place there is. That's the only space that I want to inhabit when I feel this kind of energy in my body, okay? And so if we're going to provide care, y'all, we can't be hanging in the church office, right? We can't be waiting for folks maybe at the coffee shop. We might not be able to wait in our therapy offices, right? Those of us who are theological educators, we may not be able to just hang out in the classroom this week. We might need to get ourselves where our people are, right? So thinking about what that is, but I also don't want to overstate that, because I also want to recognize that what's happening at the front lines is not conducive to the completeness and the complexity of care needs in this moment. So we need to be much more creative and visionary when we think about how to create multiple spaces within intense movement moments, including that might be all charged up with that heroic energy, to say, all right, y'all, we're feeling all this energy, but let's also designate some space and maybe designate some people, identify some people to say, hey, when you need to take that breath, when you need to feel reoriented and rerouted, re-anchored in your body, and maybe need a little bit of a break so that you can sustain yourself, right? We can't just be on this hot burn energy all the time. Where can you do that, right? And in protest spaces, you can look and look and look, and all you see is people all charged up with that energy, and then you see the police, right? That's the only two things, right? And one is an obvious threat, but the other one doesn't give you very many options either, if we're going to be really honest. And so I think one of the things when we think about how do we need to sustain, where is care provision involved in this? And I hope actually when we reconvene in a couple of weeks, Dr. Crumpton, will allow the conversation to kind of move in this direction and further deepen the conversation around this, because I think it's necessary for us not just to think about what's our public health infrastructure, right? Or what's our religious infrastructure, or what's our infrastructure around anti-racist work that needs to happen right now. We've got to think about care providing infrastructure for all of this. And I think one of the reasons why we don't get further in this necessary transformative justice work is that we don't actually know how to sustain ourselves. We know how to ride that roller coaster, right? Right, the up and then the down. We know that. Our bodies know that. That's what you said, Dr. Crumpton, right? Is there a way that this wires our body? Oh, yes, it does, right? We know when we start feeling this kind of way, when we see that video, when we see that headline, when we get that call, we know what it's like to feel that surge of energy. And we also know what it's like to feel deflated on the back end of some of this work. Those are not the circumstances that are going to help us to really sustain the necessary justice building work that we need to be about. And we got to talk about how care really interacts with that and connects with that. And maybe that's something we want to take up when we have a chance to reconvene in a couple of weeks.
That's wonderful. It's a great transition because we are just about, let's see, I think I've got So there's some questions that are in the Q&A about reading that someone can, sorry. They're wanting to know if they can read some more about where you're coming from, kind of the theoretical foundation, Dr. Moon, of your work. And also, has any study been done to discover the lack of support of many African-American men for support of many African-American men as felt by African-American women or women of color for that matter. African-American women are expected to support men if they are not considered to be against our men. As in the civil rights movement, African-American men are the focus. The question can be addressed openly. So I think I want to say a couple of things. We're going to be posting two things. I think some of the answers to those questions you can take up. First of all, think through it yourself some more and rejoin us in 2 weeks on the 18th, where we'll be talking about second waves, preparing for the long haul, which is exactly what Dr. Moon and Dr. Ortega were bringing us to start thinking about. This conversation was meant to be an introduction to just kind of the notion of disaster preparedness, disaster response, recovery, and preparedness. And then the different modality, the revolutionary, not the same as the past modalities of healing that Dorian also brought to us with radical therapy, radicalized healing, as some colleagues of mine would say. So we're going to get more specific about that because we're thinking about the long haul. And so some of the answers to those questions will be presented in that webinar. Again, that's June the 18th at 12 o'clock. It's called Second Waves, Preparing for the Long Haul. Our primary questions, we're going to get a little more specific. We're going to be talking about what it is to do care for movement work, right? And so that movement work is, of course, the activism that we're seeing in the streets, but we're also talking about care, pastoral care as a movement in and of itself, right? How do we care for the movement of pastoral care or the movement of care in general for folk in this time? Also talking about, as we're doing that, thinking about how we can develop healthy connections and bonds while we're doing this kind of work of care, right? We need to think about not just getting together, but being strategic about what I need to heal from, what you need to heal from, so that we're doing healthy connections as opposed to forms of trauma bonding, right? Which is a normative kind of practice that can happen in times like this, but we're thinking about the long haul, right? So we're going to be talking about that. And finally, also, kind of thinking theologically, what does it mean to handle conflict from a principled perspective? You can't assume that just because we all want to be well, we want to do this work, that there won't be conflict. The question is, how can our faith play a role in supporting us in handling principled conflict? So we hope that you'll join us, where we'll have some of the responses to some of these questions. Yes, anybody who, I see some things also in the chat. Yes, if you have registered, you are on our mailing list, so you will definitely get the updates about that information. It looks like some people were having some crosstalk amongst themselves, sharing email addresses, really wonderful. And again, thank you so very much. Keep an eye on the website from McCormick Theological Seminary and also the Chicago Presbytery, who join us in this work, for the videos, as well as also the presentations that were shared for today. I'll include the presentation. Unfortunately, some people couldn't hear the music, which is a big part of it. It was Stevie Wonder singing one of his famous songs, which is, the music is important because we do need music in this movement moment. So please join us. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you again for our amazing panelists, Dorian Ortega of Fly Therapy, and Zachary Moon from Chicago Theological Seminary. We will see you in 2 weeks. Take care. And please, if you could just take 1 or 2 things from what you heard today, don't let this just sit and be a webinar. Take one thing and make it personal. Allow it to be for who you are and how you want to be in this world. We'll talk to you soon on June 18th, 12 o'clock. Please continue to keep an eye out on our website. Take care.